who then are the British only European competitors for North America now?
Spain.
The Spanish, right.
Well, and a little bit of Russia.
Right. Not so worried about that. When the war came to an end in 1763, Britain was now the most powerful country in the world. Britain was kind of like the new Spain, the new European bully. So Britain was now really, undisputedly, the most powerful country in the world. But they were also deeply in debt. It turns out that fighting a world war is really expensive. So the French had been defeated, but the British were now deeply in debt. And so the king was looking for ways to save money and bring in new revenues. And what's that going to lead to that you probably already know about?
Taxes.
Taxes, right. But that same motivation also led to the Proclamation Line of 1763, proclaimed by the British king. The Proclamation Line was a line, imaginary line, drawn along the top of what geographic? The Appalachian Mountains, right. So this line runs along the top of the Appalachian Mountains. And the colonists in America were ordered to stay on the eastern side of that line. The American colonists were ordered to stay on the eastern side of that line. Which means where can't they go?
West of the Appalachian.
West of the mountains. That land, the land between the mountains and the Mississippi River, who did it belong to as far as the British were concerned?
The Indians and the Spanish.
No. The land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River.
Just them.
It belongs to the British. And yet they're telling their British subjects over here, you can't go there. And the reason was that they did not want more wars with Indians. And they knew that settlers going over those mountains would provoke more wars with Indians. And for now, the king does not want any more wars with Indians. Why not?
They're broke. It's really.
Because they're expensive. Right. And we're broke. So from the king's perspective, from the British government's perspective, this is good policy. It makes sense. They did not intend that this land would be the Indians forever. Just for now. Don't go over there and pick a fight. But to the British colonists in America, this was terrible. To the British colonists in America, what had they been fighting this war for?
Land.
Land. And so they fought all these years. And now, when the war is over, the king says, by the way, you can't have the land. And what do the colonists say? That's right. This is messed up. This is the beginning of the tensions that lead to the American Revolution. It starts with the Proclamation Line. When we have a test, you will want to tell me that it started with taxes. And just know if you start writing that, oops, that's wrong. It started with the Proclamation Line. That's what started the tensions that ultimately lead to the revolution. So this was the British Empire in 1763. Colonies in Asia, bits of the West African coast, parts of the Caribbean, and this huge part of North America. Everyone in the British Empire considered the king who lived in London their king. So just because you lived in Barbados or Jamaica or New York or Georgia didn't mean you weren't British. Does that make sense? So no matter where you are in the empire, you're still a British subject. Everybody in the empire paid taxes. everybody paid taxes. But here in the English colonies in America, they were the least taxed people in all the British Empire. They paid less taxes than anybody else in the British Empire. And maybe more significant than that, what was the only government that had ever taxed the people of the American colonies?
The church. Well, the Anglican church.
Close. What did you say?
The House
The
of
local government.
Yeah, so what would we call that?
House of Burgesses.
Yeah, so the colonial legislatures were the only governments that had ever directly taxed the people who lived in the colonies. It was their own legislatures, which in most colonies were called the assembly. So every colony, basically, had a legislature, an assembly. And how were the members of those assemblies picked?
Elite.
That's who they were, but how were they picked?
Isn't it whoever had the most land, or
What's that?
whoever had the most land?
No, that's not how they're picked.
Elections.
They're elected, right? They're elected. Remember, they're democratic elections if you're one of the qualified voters. And that meant the way people in America saw taxation, they had only been taxed by governments that they had voted for. That was the way it had been. Now, every colony also had a royal governor, a governor who was not elected by the people of the colony. Instead, the royal governors were appointed by the king. So the assemblies are elected by the voters of the colonies, but the governors are appointed by the king. And that meant that the king expected the governors to be, his man on the spot. The governors were supposed to look out for the king's interests. But in practice, the governors' salaries were paid by the colonial assemblies. And that meant, who did the governors never want to piss off? The colonial assemblies. So although in theory, because they're appointed by the king, you would think they pretty strongly represent the king's interests, in practice, governors were always hesitant to cause trouble with the assemblies, because the assemblies write their paychecks. This system This system meant that people who lived in America paid 4% the taxes that a British subject who lived in London paid. That's on average.
Maybe 4% of the taxes that.
Right. So a person who lived in London paid 25 times as much in taxes as someone in the American colonies. So people in Britain, who actually lived in Britain, they paid the highest taxes in the empire, while people who lived in America paid the lowest taxes in the empire. And now, after the 7 Years' War, Britain's in debt. So who did it seem logical to people in Britain should pay more taxes? The American colonists. And is that idea, that concept, because they want to oppress the American colonists? Not at all. The idea is they've had a free ride for a really long time. And now it's time to start paying some taxes. So to people in the British government, to ordinary British people who lived in Britain, it just seemed like common sense that they should start paying more taxes. After all, people in Britain like to say, the war got rid of the French. So the war benefited the British people who live in America. So clearly they could pay some more taxes now. In each of the colonies, there were land conflicts. That's what each of these little numbers are. through the map, each one of those is a different land conflict. Each of them is kind of different in their own local particulars, but what they had in common is what really matters for us. In each of these land conflicts, common people who wanted land were fighting against the elite. Because what they have lots of? Land, right. So it's common people who wanted land versus the elites who have lots of it. What would have alleviated these conflicts?
Giving them land. Or not having the proclamation of 1760.
Yeah, so if there was no proclamation line, right, lots of those people would go over the mountains and try to get land. The reason that we needed to spend just a minute or two on this is to make it clear once again that the people who lived over here, the colonists, were divided among themselves. They were fighting with each other, not uniting together to fight their mother country. So if you asked most common people in America in 1762, who's responsible for your problems? What's the most common answer?
The elite.
The elite. The elite here in my neighborhood. But what we're going to see over the 13 years after the war is that these British elite in America, the colonial elite, very skillfully deflect the common people's anger. They tell the common people, I know you're angry. I know you want land, but it's not my fault. Whose fault is it? It's the king's fault. It's Parliament's fault. It's Britain's fault. So join with me, my friend, and we will get rid of your oppression. And you get what I mean? Deflecting their anger. It's not me you should be angry at, my friend. It's him. Him. Come on, we'll go get them together. So we're going to see now over the next years how that actually happens in practice. You shouldn't try to write any of this down, because I'm going to change it before you get very far. But just know that this is in the PowerPoint. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through these events kind of one by one. But then to prepare for like a test essay, it's a great slide to go back to and just make sure you have all the key things in order. All right?
You don't need to write it down.
What's that?
You don't need to write any of these.
You could try, but now you're out of time.
We're not required.
Right. So as I already mentioned, the people who lived in America were the least taxed people in the empire. And that's why to people in Britain it made sense to put some taxes on them now. One thing that I guess we should make clear is that even though Britain had never taxed the people in the colonies directly, did the king or the Parliament ever doubt that they had the power to tax them? No. They just never needed to before. Do you think now they're going to regret never trying it before?
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. So in 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The first attempt, really, to tax the people in the colonies directly. The Stamp Act was not actually a tax on stamps. It was a tax on paper. A tax on anything done on paper. And so, whatever it was that was the paper item that was taxed, what would the tax collector put on it? A stamp. So the stamp just signifies the paying of the tax.